Det du sa, Søreide, var at demokrati, menneskerettigheter og økonomisk vekst uløselig sammenknyttet. Og så det spørsmålet, alle disse vekstøkonomiene demokratier? Og hvordan forholder vi oss til det? Det sånn at vi skal slutte å handle med de landene som ikke demokratier?
Jeg synes det viktig å faktisk ha en tilstedeværelse også i land der vi ser en problematisk utvikling i en eller annen form. Og det jo fordi at vi på den måten kan bidra med det vi kan til å forsøke å rette på utviklingen. For eksempel ved støtte til sivilsamfunnsorganisasjoner som driver menneskerettighets- og demokratiarbeid. Men jeg samtidig kritisk til at vi tidvis har vært for lite opptatt av å peke på til dels grove brudd på menneskerettighetene i mange land som av stor betydning for Norge å samarbeide med. Jeg har brukt mye tid og ressurser på Etiopia, et land som tidligere fikk ca. 200 millioner kroner i året til forskjellige prosjekter, og noe var stat-til-stat-bistand, ca. 10%. Der har man nå økt til ca. 600 millioner kroner, som det som nå ligger inne som en mulighet, og det særlig knyttet til klima- og energiprosjekter. I seg selv så ikke det et problem, men det et problem hvis vi samtidig ikke tar opp menneskerettigheter, hvis vi ikke sørger for at de bruddene på menneskerettigheter som påviselig ikke blir påtalt til etiopiske myndigheter. Det mye man kan si om Etiopias strategiske betydning og beliggenhet også for Norge, men det samtidig, synes jeg, ugreit å tenke seg at vi bruker ca. 600 millioner kroner i året, eller i hvert fall har muligheten til å bruke 600 millioner kroner i året, uten samtidig å være krystallklar på at det problematiske sider ved menneskerettighetssituasjonen. Jeg synes jeg taler til Heikki Holmås' fordel. Jeg synes Heikki Holmås har inntatt en mye mer ydmyk holdning til det problemkomplekset enn hans forgjenger Erik Solheim hadde. Erik Solheim så ingen problemer i Etiopia, og det mener jeg en ganske arrogant holdning når man ser store tvangsflyttingsprosjekter, man ser at mennesker lider under grunnleggende sett og blir brukt terrorlover mot hvis du opposisjonell. Det ikke greit.
Da kan jeg glede komitéleder Ine Marie Søreide med at vi tar opp i krystallklare vendinger nettopp de mange alvorlige brudd på menneskerettighetene som i Etiopia. Jeg har selv sittet og snakket grundig med Haile Mariam Desalegn, som Etiopias nye statsminister etter Meles, om akkurat det, og det var en reell samtale med en god dialog, hvor han erkjente at det var et langt stykke å gå for Etiopia, og også beskrev hvordan han sa at ja, vi har disse problemene, vi ønsker å komme oss ut av dem. Han beskrev en slags treårsplan for å komme dit. Det burde selvfølgelig ikke være en treårsplan, men en tredagersplan. Men samtidig det jo slik at vi gjør nettopp det. Og for å si sånn, grunnen til at jeg får god tid på Haile Mariam Desalegns kontor for å snakke om menneskerettigheter, jo at vi har et stort engasjement i Etiopia. For hvis vi ikke hadde engasjementet, og jeg ringte og sa at jeg vil gjerne kritisere deg for brudd på menneskerettighetene, så tviler jeg på at vi hadde hatt den samme samtalen. Så engasjement jo grunnlaget for at vi nettopp kan ta opp det. Og da sier rett ut om Etiopia, store utfordringer på demokrati, menneskerettssiden, uten tvil. Samtidig det og det også riktig, et av de landene i Afrika som skårer best på fordeling, aller best på fordeling, lav korrupsjon, ikke null, men lavt i afrikanske målestokk, og mye effektiv governance, om ikke good governance i type demokrati ennå. Jeg optimist også for Etiopia, men jeg tror vi skal både være der og ta opp, som det heter i menneskerettighetsverden, og det akkurat det vi gjør. Det da slik at dere faktisk sier at vi skal kutte investeringene og ansatsene i Etiopia? Eller det bare at dere skal ta det opp, for i så fall så trenger vi ikke å bytte regjering, for det gjør vi.
Men jeg også optimistisk på vegne av Etiopia, fordi jeg synes jeg ser noen positive trekk fra det nye lederskapet i Etiopia, og det synes jeg vi og andre land skal utnytte. Men samtidig så mener jeg at vi kan ikke ukritisk se for oss at vi skal øke støtten såpass mye uten at man også ser resultater, positive resultater. Vi har jo også vært skeptiske til at Norge som eneste land valgte å ikke stille krav til gjeldssletten i Myanmar, som vi nå gjør. Vi stiller ikke krav om at utviklingen skal fortsette i positiv retning. Og det mener jeg vi kunne ha gjort, og at samme type vilkår mener jeg vi også skal sette for en del av den støtten vi gir til Etiopia. Som jeg sa tidligere, så mener jeg at vi skal være til stede, vi skal være engasjert, både økonomisk og politisk, men samtidig mener jeg at vi må finne det balansepunktet som gjør at man ikke uten videre sier at nå tredobler vi støtten til Etiopia, særlig innenfor energi og miljø, som kjempeviktig, uten at man krever noe tilbake. Det kan ikke være sånn at vi skal betale 600 millioner kroner for å få lov til å snakke menneskerettigheter med Etiopia.
Så da må vi ha ny regjering likevel.
Jeg tror det.
Men hva var det svarte? Skal vi fortsette eller ikke med...
Jeg sier det, vi skal fortsette engasjementet. Vi har vært kritiske til at økningen var så stor og så massiv over så kort tid.
Ja, så det vil reversere den da?
Altså, vi har sagt at...
Det må være logikken at det er kritisk til den.
Ja, men det har vi også foreslått i budsjettene våre.
Men når du sier tar opp dette med gjeldslett og Myanmar, nå er dette Afrika-seminar, og sist jeg sjekket så var det i Asia, men hvis det er et land hvis det virkelig er et land jeg har veldig god samvittighet for vår innsats på demokratisiden, så er det jo Myanmar, hvor vi var det første vestlige landet som engasjerte oss, som trodde på de nye myndigheter, som engasjerte oss og var tungt inne i omtrent alle de store omstillingsprosessene i det landet, med gamle opprørsgrupper som nå er ved forhandlingsbordet, med en regjering som har vist som allerede har beveget landet forbi den regionale standarden. Altså det er i dag mer demokrati, mer ytringsfrihet, mer inkludering i Myanmar enn hva som er gjennomsnittet i landene rundt. Det er langt fra bra nok, men jeg tror at vi kan tillate oss å ta et medansvar for at det har gått i riktig retning. Så vi har ikke bare stilt krav, vi har vært til stede og hjulpet dem med å gjøre det, og det fortsetter vi å gjøre. I den sammenhengen var det logisk at vi da kompletterte slettingen av et av Norges historiens mest idiotiske støtteprogrammer, nemlig skipseksportkampanjen, som vi har kuttet ut for omtrent alle andre land, men som vi holdt igjen på Myanmar fordi det var militærdiktatur der. Nå er det ikke det lenger. Da gjorde vi det samme som vi gjorde med mange andre land, både fullt ut demokratisk land og ikke-demokratisk land, den gang vi slettet resten av den gjelden, som vi uansett aldri hadde fått igjen.
Som trodde det var Syria som skulle avspore dette fra Afrika. Men det ble Myanmar. Vi har 2 minutter igjen, og jeg lurer på om vi kan bruke det på sikkerhetspolitikk. Bør Norge gjøre mer? Ha en mer aktiv rolle, sende flere militære bidrag, andre bidrag, til å løse afrikanske konflikter? 1 minutt hver?
Ja, absolutt. Jeg har ment det i veldig mange år, og mener at det er essensielt at vi både deltar mer i FN, og at vi deltar mer i FN i Afrika. Og jeg tror jeg har jobbet mer enn omtrent noen andre i regjeringsapparatet for å sette i gang et svensk-norsk bataljonsbidrag til Darfur. Da den UNAMI-styrken kom opp, den var ferdig utstyrt, trent, klar omtrent på flyplassen, ble til slutt stoppet i en diplomatisk krise mellom...
But since 2 of our panelists in the discussion that immediately follows, the Norwegian ambassador in Addis Ababa and Goitom, are specialists in that area, and since we have a whole panel just on it immediately afterwards, I shall try to range much more broadly, therefore inevitably much more generally, much more vaguely. But the place I would start, and what I will overwhelmingly talk about, is what has been happening in Africa, not what has been happening in the rest of the world. One of the great truisms of foreign policy analysis is that foreign policy begins at home. So if we're talking about Norwegian policy towards Africa, as we just have been, that is much, much more about what Norway is like than it is about what Africa is like. You have only to look at human rights, international law, corporate social responsibility, excellent principles that Ilpi upholds, and principles much more clearly upheld, I have to say, in Norway than they are in all too much of Africa. But I am constantly irritated reading a lot of stuff that gets published to this day about Africa's international relations that then breaks down into a section on the United States and Africa, Europe and Africa, China and Africa, whatever it might be. And the important thing, I think, is to turn it round and ask, what is Europe like from Africa? What is China like from Africa? And that, in turn, depends, just as much as Norway, its policy depends on what Norway is like, on what Africa is like, and what has been changing there. And the key question, inevitably, is what has been happening to African states. Not in their international relations, but primarily in their relations with their own populations, and only secondarily, carrying on from that, their relations with one another, which have also changed very significantly in recent decades, and then, last of all, their relations with the outside world. And the first very obvious point, but the one that we need to make, is that these states have survived, in virtually every case, along the lines laid down over a century ago by colonial partition. It's worth making that point because if we look at Europe over the last 25 years, and especially at Central Europe, the state structure of Central Europe has been totally and utterly transformed. What was the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, East and West Germany just aren't there any longer. It's amazing. It's a thing that we don't think about, I think, nearly enough. And when you get to Africa, where the states were almost entirely created from outside, laid down along ludicrously artificial boundaries, drawn in London or Paris or wherever, they're still there. And all of the cases of state division that we have seen over that period, Eritrea, in Somaliland, most recently in South Sudan, and the one outstanding one, which is Western Sahara, are all cases of attempting to reconstruct as independent states entities that were separate under colonial rule. Even in the case of South Sudan, the border between what is now called Plain Sudan and South Sudan follows exactly what were called the closed districts laid down by the British colonial government between what was seen as Arab North Sudan and Black African South Sudan. And we're now over 50 years in most cases since the independence of most African states. And over that half century, those borders have solidified, they've become accepted. They are now, despite the bizarre character of their original formation and the mishmash very often of different ethnic, religious or regional groups within them, they are the basic building blocks, and I can see no plausible prospect that they're going to change. What has changed is what has been happening within those states, in terms both of the changes over time in the half century or so since independence, and especially in more recent decades, which is, and equally in the level of variance between states. On the map, they all look the same, they're all blocked out and they're different colours. Inside, of course, they're very different prospects indeed, and an obvious problem of talking about the whole continent, except I have to exclude Arab North Africa, is that however hard I try, we are bound to blur over some of those differences. There are certainly cases, such as Somalia or the Democratic Republic of Congo, which can even now plausibly be described only as quasi-states, things that are supposed to be states, things that look like states on the map, but in which their formal existence doesn't indicate any capacity to operate as states in terms of their ability to control their territory, their people, provide a structure of governance operating across the national territory, which can actually be made to work. States like this are often described as failed states. They weren't actually ever states at all, Somalia or the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa does have its failed states, and the two that I would pick out particularly would be Zimbabwe, behind the facade of its recent entirely fraudulent elections, and Eritrea, both states born out of often heroic liberation movements, solidified into autocracies in which the legacy of liberation is rapidly dying away. Only a small minority of Zimbabweans can now remember freedom from white minority rule back in 1980, probably only a minority of Eritreans. And these are unquestionably states, but states which have appallingly and dramatically failed to meet the legitimate aspirations of their own people. But at the other end of the spectrum, we now have, for the first time indeed, a few states, amongst which Ghana and Senegal, I suppose, would stand out, that have developed into what appear to be stable multi-party democracies of a kind with which we're generally familiar in Europe, in which regular elections, reasonably honestly conducted, hold a genuine prospect that a victorious opposition party will then peacefully be able to take over control of the national government. But a much commoner pattern is something that falls between these two. It is the emergence of a reasonably manageable modus vivendi, if you like, in the relations between governments and their peoples. When you look at these maps blocked out by democracy monitoring organizations, they're often described as flawed democracies or hybrid regimes or some jargon of that kind, which characteristically describes what they're not rather than what they are, but in which a government is perhaps only partially or nominally democratic, in which the chances of ousting the regime peacefully and democratically are at best pretty slight, but in which nonetheless there are now, to an extent that there weren't, I think, in the 30 years after independence, recognised limits beyond which governments accept that they cannot go. There is now, much more than before, a need for regimes to demonstrate the benefits that accrue to their people. Straightforward military regimes in Africa are now effectively a thing of the past, let alone the kind of grotesquely personalised state run by the likes of an Idi Amin or Jean Bedel Bokassa, or indeed a Mobutu. We have yet to see in Africa, or in sub-Saharan Africa, the kinds of spontaneous uprisings or demonstrations that led to the fall of regimes in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, and which beyond that, of course, have challenged governments in places such as Turkey or even Brazil. But to my mind, it is not now inconceivable that similar uprisings could occur, significantly fueled by two of the most important social developments in Africa over recent decades. The first of these, immediately evident to anyone who sets foot in the continent, has been the staggeringly rapid spread of the mobile telephone or cell phone, which you look at the graphs and it just goes up like the wall of a cliff. And this is not simply a phenomenon confined to a few classy elites in capital cities. It has made possible a spread of information and communication right from the cities out to the countryside. And a friend of mine who was recently conducting research, he's an anthropologist, in Burkina Faso, in rural Burkina Faso in West Africa, way out in the sticks, and he wanted to telephone his wife back in England to find out how she and the children were getting on, and pulled out his cell phone and no signal. And a villager came up and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "If you want a signal, you've got to climb up that tree." So up he went, and there he was in no time, perched in the upper branches, chattering away to his wife in Manchester. But this is now possible in a way that it wasn't before. And since people in cities in Africa characteristically still maintain very close relationships back with their families, you have a kind of national conversation of a sort that you previously could not have. But the second, and very closely linked to that, is that it is not now just a national conversation, it is an international conversation. The spread of African diasporas worldwide, something very visible in this room, certainly in Europe, in the United States, well beyond that, has again been a dramatic development of recent years, and they too, of course, retain close connections back with their homelands. Much of the dynamism that you see on the ground, especially out in the countryside in Africa today, is driven by Africans, perhaps from that town, from that village, who've been out abroad, maybe for decades, coming back and seeing what they can do to put their newly acquired knowledge to work back in the places that they came from. But the same conversations, of course, are going on amongst those who remain in the diaspora, and there is a spread of ideas, of ways of thinking, of a sense of possibilities, which again did not exist in the rigid one-party, monarchical, really, states of the immediate post-independence era. And what all these things do is that they mean, even in the absence of effective formal constraints on government power, which are often pretty limited, even in those countries which have constitutions and federalist systems and human rights provisions that in principle guarantee them, is that there are increasing informal constraints that have the effect of signalling to those in power, that power is, in some degree at least, limited and even accountable.
I have my colleague Goitun Gebre-Luel, who's an advisor at Ilpi and also our country representative for Ethiopia. On his right, I have Odd Inge Kvalheim, the Norwegian ambassador both to Ethiopia and the African Union. On his right, Kjell Roland, the director of Nordpan, and Christopher Clapham, who you've already been introduced to. I think we're going to take this opportunity to have a 5-minute introduction for you to reflect a little bit on the discussion and the themes that you've heard so far, but related very much to where you are coming from, your research area or your particular organization and perspective. And I think we'll also come back to, it was mentioned that the Mozambican Minister of Planning, who was supposed to speak here today, who unfortunately had to leave, we actually had an opportunity to speak to him yesterday, and I think he raised a number of interesting issues that I'm going to relay to you later on in terms of questions and observations. And obviously this will be an opportunity to open up for questions and answer from the audience who's been sitting here quite patiently since 8:30 this morning. So let me first hand it over to you, Odd Inge Kvalheim. The expression was used before about insiders and outsiders. You're an outsider from within, that is, sitting in Addis Ababa. You have a perspective on not only the rapid changes that have taken place in Ethiopia, but in particular the African Union. And what are your perspectives and what you've heard so far, in particular on a sort of broader African perspective, as we'll be speaking more specifically on Ethiopia later. Odd Inge, please.
Thank you very much. I'm placed in Addis, and Addis is a good point of departure when it comes to what our foreign minister was alluding to earlier today, regionalism and increasing regional cooperation. We see that, as many was mentioning, Africa is rising in many ways, and there's certainly a focus on the economic aspects of that. I think there's also a need to look at and to follow political Africa, so to speak. We see within the African Union and among African countries an increasing will to engage in challenges, regarding challenges on the African continent. That's been apparent in Somalia with the peace operation AMISOM. It was apparent when it came to the situation in Mali, and a host of other issues lately. Zimbabwe, Egypt, Central African Republic, and so on and so forth. What is accompanying that increasing will to engage is also an increasing will to find common ground, to find consensus and a common approach to these challenges among African countries. Among African countries, as with European countries and other regions, each country have their own unique interests and perspectives, and it takes political will to overcome those in terms of finding common ground. Let me use one example when it comes to that will to consensus, so to speak, which also illustrates that the most important role of the African Union, the political one, is often under-communicated. Or not seen enough with Western eyes, so to speak. After the crisis in Mali, ECOWAS was very quick in proposing a peacekeeping operation. They sent a draft operation concept to the UN, to the Security Council, which was more or less rejected, I would say, both partly because of the quality of this concept, but also the idea of engaging in Mali. What happened then was that for over a period of several months, you got a broader set of countries to convene around a table that they all felt ownership to, that is the African Union. And it was at the point where you found common ground between countries such as Algeria and Nigeria, that it created foundation for engagement, whether it would be from the EU, but also from the UN. It was very clear that Mali was considered far away. Just a few weeks
months later, we had a terrorist attack in Amenas, and all of a sudden Mali was very close. Then the question arises: how? Because in following that, there was a focus on what can Norway do, what are we doing, how can we engage, and a question that we can ask them: can we really be everywhere in the world where this possibly could happen? I think I think that would be a hard, a tall order to follow up. The second best, I think, or what is more effective engagement, is to support those organizations that do have an influence and do engage to address those complex and multifaceted problems. And the African Union is such an actor. From the Norwegian side, we have a large number of embassies in Africa, a lot more than many of our neighbors in Europe, around 20 embassies. We have a long history of engagement through development cooperation, solidarity, and we have what shall I call it, a brand name in Africa that is important to build on when it comes to supporting also the African Union. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, and we'll come back to that. And also thank you for giving us also this perspective very much on international relations as seen from Addis and the headquarters of the African Union, and very much the geopolitical perspective that's taking place. We're going to move to Kjell Roland from Nordfund. There have been a lot of questions or discussions on investment in Africa, in terms of Africa rising in different sectors, economic growth. Before I give you the word, I want to, as I alluded to the Mozambican minister before, when we at Ilpi, we've been asked by the Norwegian Oil for Development Fund to do an evaluation of the petroleum sector in Mozambique, and we had a conversation with him. He said during this conversation that in Mozambique, there are lots of people who want to give advice now. He actually said the expression, there seem to be almost more teachers than students when it comes to this. And he said at the end of the day, we believe that all the countries here, when they're represented, they have commercial interests. And that is fair, but that nobody's going to give free advice or impartial advice on behalf of a government. That was his perspective. Now, as heading a government-funded private equity, investing in Africa and elsewhere, what is your perspective? And also this idea that, do you give advice, or is it just commercial interest, taking also into account some of the very impressive return on investment that Nordfund has had over the past years? Kjell Roland, please.
Thank you. No, I guess the answer is no, we don't give advice. We invest in commercial entities, we prove that it's possible to do it on the ground. But I'll come back to that. I'd like to start with a reference to the African Union, because in a sense that illustrates a lot of the new Africa. 1.5 years back, African Union had a special session on the Millennium Development Goals. What is it that we would like? And the message was interesting in the sense that it was quite clear. 2 important messages. This time we would like to have some say. Not all of it to be decided in Europe and the US. This time we would like to have a bit of influence. And secondly, if you ask us, what is it that we would like to see beyond 2015? Economic growth and employment.
And foreign policy debate here in Norway, and seem to have a little bit of a different perspective on our 2 political representatives here, and in many ways it does represent a different perspective on this discussion about where is Africa going, growth, investment, MDGs, and then on the other hand, what type of governance, and if you like the Mo Ibrahim agenda that Ine Søreide alluded to this morning. Can you give some perspectives on Ethiopia and of course Africa more generally?
Yes. Yes, being a researcher, I'm going to be focusing on other aspects of Africa's international relations,
yes.
The Nording and Kjell Roland. I'd like to pick up on the issue of African international relations, and if it makes sense to speak of Africa as a collective agent in international relations. Is there such thing as an African collective agency in international relations, what is the prospects for it, and what would be the basis of Africa as a unitary actor in international relations. And my answer to that would be a disappointing yes and no. The reasons for it may be a bit more interesting. The basis for approaching Africa as a collective agent in international relations would be three main factors. One is that African countries have a common and significant shared historical experience of colonialism and underdevelopment, as well as being a marginal actor in international affairs. This was, of course, the basis or the reason for the establishment of the OAU after independence. As a consequence of this shared experience, there is also the discursive element where African leaders, both leaders and ordinary Africans, think and speak of united Africa, often African solutions, or African solutions for African problems, etc. So the objective is certainly there. And thirdly, there is the more tangible element of the African Union as an organization, which has as its objective the integration of the continent and acting with a united front in the world arena. However, when it comes to actual state behavior, there isn't much of a collective agency. As most of you know, there has been much improvement over the last 10 years or so, as has been mentioned, in particularly peace and security issues on the continent. Somalia is a good example. Also, collective stance on unconstitutional change of power, which has also been mentioned. But much remains in terms of translating the continent's numerical, political, and natural resources into political influence in international affairs. This has meant that African states have not been able to coordinate their engagement with the outside world. So, the mega states of the rising powers, China, India, Brazil, approach Africa. They have an Africa policy, whereas African states individually may not even have a systematic China policy, let alone a continental Africa policy. This is, of course, caused by the fact that despite having many of these commonalities, African states are much more diverse than what is often thought, both economically and politically. For example, economically, the whole continent at large is associated with the export of raw materials and the commodities. However, when we look at, for example, export of energy, we see that 5 countries account for more than 90% of energy exports, and 12 countries more than 90% of mineral exports. Politically, although the continent at large is associated with authoritarianism, there is significant variations amongst, for example, Africa's developmental states, such as Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda, which have, how should I put it?
You're not seeking re-election, keep in mind. Unlike our previous panel, don't worry.
I'm trying to be diplomatic. They have diplomatic challenges, democratic challenges, as opposed to Ghana, which would be much less concerned about external interference with regards to human rights and other issues. These factors make it quite difficult to construct collective strategies with in regards to engaging with the outside world, basically. In addition to this, there's also the issue of regionalism, which has been mentioned today and which is often regarded as a positive aspect, and in many ways it is. But on the other hand, these regional economic communities have come to become a competitor in some respects to the African Union and an African collective agency, and in some ways also act as an impediment to an African collective agency. Because of this, both for analytical and policy purposes, approaching international relations of Africa is best approached by looking at the states of Africa in subcontinental groups of states, such as, you know, the developmental states of Africa, exporters of minerals, energy exporters, even for the African states themselves. It would be much more realistic to construct common strategies in how to engage with the world, outside world, based on these subcontinental groups, rather than try to opt for the unrealistic, at the moment in time, African collective response. There was not much on Ethiopia, but I think we can pick up on it.
I think in your yes and no bracket of collective identity and response to Africa, we also heard earlier about the African Union being the only political union that came out unconditionally condemning the coup in Egypt as a military coup. So that was in your, I guess, your yes bracket. But if we move to the sort of the no bracket and the regionalization, Christopher Clapham, you spoke earlier about the theory of a hegemon in Africa, which perhaps is not there anymore. Who are some of these emerging powers that are alluded to, but we haven't really heard that many examples? We heard Kjell Roland mention Mozambique, obviously the countries that are benefiting from this boom in the energy sector, maybe punching above their weight, as to use your phrase. But what else is sort of moving when it comes to regionalism and countries and emerging powers in Africa that are perhaps not that well known outside of Africa? Christopher Clapham.
Angola, I would certainly mention as one. That is a case of a country very clearly driven by an oil boom, with its own peculiar domestic structure and the growth of a quite large but extremely state-dependent sort of class, as it were, of political entrepreneurs. The one that is still failing to punch up to its weight is Nigeria. Now, Nigeria in West Africa is just massively dominant in both economic terms as a major oil producer and demographic terms as by far the largest state in the region. And its problem is always the fragmentation of its own domestic politics, which is so complex, so intense, so encompassing of the attention of its practitioners, that Nigeria actually thinks about foreign policy much less than you might expect. Two others which have grown significantly in influence because they've managed to crack essentially their domestic political issues would be Ghana and Senegal, which are emerging, I think, in some ways as the leaders of Francophone and Anglophone West Africa, which is not what you would have expected of Ghana. You might well have expected it of Senegal, which has a long tradition as the most evolved, most educated of the West African Francophone states. And a really interesting one, of course, is Ethiopia, which we'll certainly get onto later in the panel after lunch, which has grown economically, even if I don't believe all the figures, nonetheless at a pretty staggering rate, but which has enormous difficulty in translating that into regional influence just because of the very fraught regional relationships within the Horn. But I'm longing to hear something from the floor.
Yes, that was my next move. Thank you.
Share with you some of my thoughts and reflections on the dynamics of peace and conflict in contemporary Africa in general and the Horn of Africa in particular. As Kjetil already mentioned, or it's also indicated in the program, the title of my presentation is on whether what's happening in Africa is towards consolidation of peace or deepening or kind of like emergence of new types of conflict. And of course, it's not like one or the other. It's not kind of like either or thing, because one could trace both dimensions. But at least as far as the Horn of Africa is concerned, the balance sheet is on the negative, i.e. there's more conflict than peace. But in the second part of my talk, I will also pick up a couple of points. Some of them have already been addressed by the previous panelists. And then I also add some new dimensions of kind of like in the direction of peace building. Of course, when it comes to the definition of the Horn of Africa, it varies from the widest, which includes also Kenya and then Uganda, and also when it's very, very small, only Somalia. But here I take the conventional definition of the Horn, which consists of Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, the Sudans, and Djibouti. Of course, occasionally I will make reference to the significant others to the Horn of African countries, particularly, of course, Kenya and Uganda, which makes me to the greater Horn of Africa. In most of the literature in the Horn of Africa, the region is depicted as one of the most conflict-ridden parts of the continent. And here, I would like to focus on the less emphasized but equally prominent drivers of conflict in the Horn of Africa than the usual story of, democratic failure to consolidate democracy or kind of like this democratic deficiency. That part is well covered in the literature, and of course it will come up in many of the other factors as kind of a cross-cutting issues, but I will not dwell on the process of democratization per se. So, what are the drivers of conflict which I'm highlighting here? First is the contested nature of statehood. By that I mean, and of course it's a truism and it's too obvious to overstate the artificiality of the state borders in Africa. Colonial borders in general and African borders in particular are very, very artificial. This can be seen just from the straight line that the colonial powers have drawn, bringing together very diverse people, a high level of diversity in terms of religion, ethnicity, and all sorts of things. And of course, there are other modes of polities in pre-colonial Africa, and on the some of the times, the basis of belonging was either geographical location or kinship or some sort of economic logic which brought these communities together. But in many parts of Africa, they were forcefully brought in a more artificial way into one polity. In the Horn of Africa, if this is not enough, there's another dimension which makes the state hugely contested. And this is, perhaps the Horn of Africa is one of the few places in Africa where the project of the nation state was tried with dire consequences. It's not only bringing diverse people together suddenly, not having the time to get to know each other and then come up with a more inclusive basis of belonging, but government trying to forge national identity from so-called core groups, or the project of cultural homogenization and political centralization. And Ethiopia and the Sudan are perfect examples where the nation-state project was tried and it had utterly failed. The result being how both of them, from both states, new states were born, and part of that being this kind of like the attempt by the governments to forge national identity forcefully and through cultural homogenization. And it's a very, very a similar historical parallel in Europe, but where it succeeded, it has failed, utterly failed in the African context, and particularly in the Horn of Africa. And of course, this issue of, when I say contested statehood, I also mean like the image of the state, or the identity of the state itself is contested. Oftentimes we hear about the legitimacy deficiency of the regime, so the particular government. Here what I'm talking about is the legitimacy of the state itself. And to what extent that people are disaffected, or they don't relate to, whether to the idea of Ethiopia or the idea of Somalia or the idea of Eritrea. And this is partly because the states are equated with some dominant groups. This is also, similar features can be seen in other parts of Africa. In West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire would be a very interesting example, where conflict arose as a result of also contestation over national identity. Not far from the Horn in Tanzania, we find competing nationalisms, Zanzibar nationalism rivaling Tanzanian nationalism, or in North Africa, relatively so-called culturally more homogeneous. In recent years, the region has seen the rise of Berber nationalism, for instance. So in a way, this contestation over national identity, or the image of the state, is one important driver of conflict, more so in the Horn of Africa.
How can we see the processes in the Horn being reflected elsewhere in Africa? Morten, I'll give the floor to you first.
Thank you, Kjetil, and let me start by saying congratulations with the day. This is, I think that your center is a major achievement, not only for Ilpi, but also hopefully for the African studies in Norway. So I'm very happy about being here today and joining you on the occasion. And thanks also to my colleague for the wonderful intervention. Much to agree with and a few things to disagree with. So, and I will not say much about the Horn of Africa, but try to sort of speak a little bit more general and also say a little bit about how I see these things from a slightly different perspective, sort of Central West Africa point of view. This issue about sort of consolidating peace or emerging new conflicts. I mean, first of all, and here I would like to start where the previous speaker left off, is that undoubtedly I think parts of Africa is improving. That does not necessarily mean that there is not a deficit in many places concerning both individual political rights and more individual issues concerning democracy and these kind of things. This clearly is a deficit in many places concerning these kind of issues. But also to a large extent, Africa is improving when it comes both to its governance, to its institutional capacity, and there is also growth. We can then have a huge argument, a long argument about what are the real growth figures, whether it's 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9% in some of these countries. But I mean, we need to acknowledge that Africa is growing economically speaking, and that growth is quite remarkable because a good part of this growth has taken place in a period when the rest of the world has been more or less in a financial recession. And that is quite remarkable for this continent, and that is something that we need to acknowledge. And but still, I mean, I think that for Africa as a whole, when it comes both to its economic growth and the sustainability of that growth, but also with regard to consolidating peace and moving forward, Africa is still standing more or less at a watershed, and it could go both ways, if you like.
Also like to take this opportunity to congratulate Ilpi on the establishment of this center, and also thank you, Dereje, for an interesting and enlightening presentation. Many things have been said already, and many terms have been used, but I would like to make a few remarks and a few points, and I would like to actually somehow go back to the basis a little bit. When I give lectures to my students, I always try to make them understand the terms we are using, and also to ask the right questions. And in relation to this debate, I think it's very important to actually ask ourselves and try to define what we actually mean by peace. Because when we talk about consolidating peace, what kind of peace are we trying to consolidate? And consolidating peace for whom and on what terms? And I'm, this might be very basic for this kind of crowd, but it's still important to remind ourselves to go back to those basics. Because too often we get stuck in statistics, which clearly says that there are fewer wars in Africa now than there was in the period after the end of the Cold War. But these statistics basically record that there isn't armed violence on a certain scale anymore. It doesn't say anything about structural violence. It doesn't say anything such as inequality, poverty, different forms of exclusion, and all these things. And so again, I think it's really important to think about what kind of peace are we talking about, what kind of peace are we trying to consolidate, and that peace should obviously go deeper and broader than the absence of large-scale violence. Another trend which has been highlighted lots of times today is the economic growth, and as it's been said, some of the countries in the world that has been having the fastest growing economies are in Africa in percentage. So there are few wars, and we see economic growth, and these are clearly indications on improvements on certain aspects. However, when you start again to analyze what's laying behind these figures, when you go in detail, you realize that the answers are not as simple as that. Because growth, I think we all agree that growth undoubtedly is essential for a more peaceful and a prosperous Africa. But again, we have to ask the right questions: growth for whom, on what terms, in what sectors, and not least, how do we distribute that growth? Still, almost half of the population living in sub-Saharan Africa live in what we call poverty, and empirically, we know that there is a clear correlation between poverty and violence and instability. And so, as long as half of the population live in poverty, there is a potential and there is a chance for we will see more turbulence because of that, I think.
When it comes to Dereje's positioning of Ethiopia's pleasant enterprises in Somalia, do you support that view?
Thank you, Shetel, very much, and thank you for having me here. I will, in fact, try to speak as a white Somali, limiting myself a little bit really to the region, or to the regional and even sometimes local setting, more than my colleagues before me who had the capacity to speak on Africa as a whole, or at least on the whole region. But I think we can complement each other in this regard sometimes. So I guess Somalia has interesting lessons to teach, sometimes really counterintuitive lessons on, for instance, the contested nature of statehood or even state formation, also on issues like peace building and development. And let me just highlight a few issues, some, so to say, on the positive or optimist side, some on the pessimist side, where Somalia, I think, differs really from what has been said before, and where we have to say there are a couple of issues we can think about before I then take the lecture on the Ethiopia's new peace-building role in the Horn. I think one interesting phenomenon, of course, and it has been actually alluded to already by Goitom earlier this day, that Somalia seems to be a very particular case when it comes to foreign intervention and external political interventions in the civil war, ending the civil war, and consolidating peace and political order again. I guess what can be learned from Somalia, at least in my perspective, and I think there's a lot of literature and other opinions supporting it, is that foreign interventions in this case didn't really work. And the question is, do they really work? I mean, probably Somalia is really particular in the sense that it collapsed so completely. However, it was never in a stage of persistent anarchy. I guess there's always this myth of, the absence of statehood means the absence of law and order, which is definitely never the case, I guess. And there, Somalia is no different from any other setting where this would have happened, if it happens. I guess you always have fallback options, and in the case of Somalia, of course, it was local traditional authorities, it was customary law, in Somali called Her, it was the Islamic law, Sharia. In a Somali setting, in another context, it would have been different normative orders. So the absence of government since 1991 never meant anarchy. That's
Marcus is a white, Somali Sterling is definitely a white, Zanzibari has been living there 4 years working for us, and Tanzania Sterling, well then finally we reached the peace.
Well, I don't know.
Or what?
Trying to consolidate peace and also emerging conflict in Tanzania, so it falls right under the title for this panel discussion.
Please.
But first I'd just like to touch real quickly on a couple of points that Dereja made. Initially, and I'm going to skip the first one, but just jump right into land-related conflicts and pastoralism. Across Africa, land's not just being grabbed for industrial farming, but various other uses. Mining, tourism, and even conservation falls into that category. And these are all threatening traditional livelihoods, often for the benefit of these traditional people. Conflict over land is not only driven by external actors either, but internal migration and population pressures. In addition to policies that promote agriculture and allow large tracts of land to be sold to foreign investors, conservation policies and other industries are displacing communities, both pastoral and agrarian, threatening traditional livelihoods. Necessitating in Tanzania the difficult discussion on land tenure, and I don't think Tanzania is alone in that category, and also raises issues of identity. Also, in terms of rising inequality and demographic shifts across both in the context of the Horn, but across the entire continent, it's not just an Africa thing. This is something that's happening even here in Europe. And in Tanzania, I'm going to throw some statistics out here, so you know, guys, don't take. It's the mini skirt isn't too long. It's very mini. Our analysis of conflict events from 1997 to 2012 shows that a region of Tanzania is 3 times more likely to experience violent conflict if the average age of that region is 35 versus 44. So I mean, there is definitely a youth opportunity and opportunities for youth, but there also is a real danger in some of these demographic shifts if governments don't pay attention and put in place policies that will address this kind of youth bulge or ticking time bomb, as pessimists, I would say, describe it. And kind of moving more directly into Tanzania, Ilpi is currently running a long-term project looking at the drivers of conflict across Tanzania, and both the political, social, and economic dynamics at play currently and through the 2015 election cycle, which will be a very historic election in Tanzania, hopefully under a new constitution. And Tanzania has been considered a haven of peace, kind of this consolidating peace. Many look to Tanzania. And it's in a turbulent region, but it is undergoing significant changes that have the potential to either cement it as a regional leader in terms of governance, or for it to kind of follow the path of some of its more turbulent neighbors, with continued social and religious tensions and unrest. So like I said, Tanzania has started a constitutional review process at the end of 2011, and this is notable because Tanzania has been ruled by one political party since independence. They've changed names midway through, but it's the same political party. And I think this process reflects the increasing pressure of a more solidified democratic multi-party system, which is a positive sign. This unprecedented opportunity for Tanzanians to provide their input to the government was welcomed both in mainland Tanzania and semi-autonomous Zanzibar. So for the first time, governments in Tanzania were actively seeking citizen input, which again highlights the emergence of a more robust democracy, and hopefully that trend can continue. And the development of the current draft constitution is again there's been a remarkable level of citizen participation, with nearly 1 million citizen opinions collected using direct engagement, SMS, email. So this process is opening a new door for a new opportunity, but it's also promoting new challenges.
Things actually, both taking up points that Dereja raised. First, he was absolutely right about the contested nature of the state in the Horn of Africa, and frankly, we've seen the bodies. But the point I wanted to make is that the Ethiopian state, and I suspect also, though we have much less information about it, the Eritrean state, have proved much more resilient than one might plausibly have expected. In the case of Ethiopia, I'd point briefly to 3 bits of evidence. First, 1998, when Eritrea occupied the disputed areas on the border between the 2 countries, the Ethiopian government itself, which had tended from its background in the TPLF in Tigray to regard Ethiopia in that famous phrase as a museum of peoples, was completely astonished by the level of nationalist reaction from people all over Ethiopia. The state, that is to say, even without the government, had the idea of the state had a capacity to mobilize people that the government had never expected, all the way down to Gambela. The second one is the only occasion that we've ever had on which popular opinion in Ethiopia has been tested in anything even remotely approaching a free and fair election was in 2005. That rapidly ceased to be free and fair the moment the opposition looked as if it was winning it. But what struck me then was that the EPRDF government was faced by 2 opposition parties, one of a more Ethiopian nationalist kind, the other pushing for a more determined implementation of the formal provisions of the constitution on ethnic devolution. And it was the Nationalist Party, even well outside areas traditionally considered part of historic Highland Ethiopia, that got significantly more support. The third pointer is simply the succession of Haile Mariam Desalegn, who is a Walaita and a Protestant Christian from the deep south-west of Ethiopia, peacefully as Prime Minister of Ethiopia. Now we have to see how that will go. We will have to see what kind of control he builds up, how successful he is. But not so long ago, that would just have been inconceivable. A Walaita? From Sodo? Give us a chance. And a Protestant Christian, a very clearly Protestant Christian, not an Orthodox. That is to say, there does appear to be a capacity for broadening the scope of the Ethiopian state, though to nothing like the extent of its national population and boundaries. Second point I wanted to take up was the land grab issue. If you talk to Meles Zenawi about this, he used to get very angry. He'd say, you Westerners just want to turn the lowlands of Ethiopia into a kind of zoo, into a game park, where tourists can go and be photographed with fancy-looking natives in funny clothes. We want to give these people the opportunity for development that they have never had. And Meles's vision was something like the prairie states of the United States. And I'm sure I have to correct Dereji there. Africa does not have 51% of the world's arable land, or anything even remotely like it. What I think you must have meant is 51% of the world's supposedly unused arable land. Was that it? Yeah, good. You think of India, China, the United States, Canada. It's area, a land that is supposedly free, and which, as Dereji rightly pointed out, isn't. And Meles's vision is it's not a disgraceful vision. And when you're looking at this, you do have to look at least at the possibilities for transforming the lives of people, and people in all of these peripheral areas of Ethiopia have had a god-awful existence for a long time. If it can be made to work, it needs to be respected. But having said that, the points I then make are, firstly, very, very little has happened on the ground yet that will tell us what the actual results of these massive plans would be. Secondly, that much of Africa does have a long experience of over-ambitious agricultural development schemes. In Britain, we tend to think of the Tanzanian groundnut scheme of the 1940s and 1950s. Many African soils are very fragile. I'd love to see a proper agronomical analysis of whether sustained rice cultivation, for instance, in Gambela is possible. So we need a very open mind on that. And the point at which I absolutely agree with Dereji is that consultation with the local populations has not been inadequate, it has been zero. One final point I'd like to make, which goes to the question of how widely spread social and economic change in Ethiopia has been. Do you all know the word fistula?
Yeah.
Anyone involved in Ethiopia certainly will. It is a birthing industry with injury, without going into the gruesome gynecological details, caused by forcing very young girls into marriage and childbirth at an age when their bodies just can't make it. And there has been for many years a wonderful institution in Addis Ababa, the Fistula Hospital, one of Australia's 2 great contributions to Ethiopia, the other one of course being the gum tree, which existed simply to cure women with this. It's not a disease, it's a surgical condition. And most recently, I was talking to an Australian who was just back from Addis Ababa, so I asked how the Fistula Hospital's getting on. They've run out of patients. They've been scouring Ethiopia. They can't find women with fistula any longer. Just wonderful. You know, if that's true, and it's just one hearsay report, it does suggest, along with the figures on the drop in mother-child mortality, that something really is taking place to Ethiopia that's not just large-scale capitalist-style development. So that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you so much. If some of you are angry on my rather Melles-like decision to cancel the debate, please, it will be an opportunity at 4 o'clock when we will reconvene at Parkveien, our Ilpi facilities just down the road, where it is not only going to have a free lunch today, we're going to have a free dinner too, and drinks, and we can chat and talk and discuss as long as you want. Now we're going to have a 5 minutes break, stretch our legs, get some coffee, air it out, and then we're going to have the...
To share this thoughts with you on Salafism in Africa, the growth and emergence of Salafism in Africa. Recent developments in Sahel and Somalia, in Nigeria, and so on, has put a lot of attention to this concept of Salafism, or Wahhabism, as it's often been described as. And it's become like a new buzzword of the day in terms of religious developments, not only in Africa, but also beyond. The focus when it comes to Africa on Salafism has largely been from a security perspective, which is understandable in light of developments both in Somalia and in Sahel. But I want to raise an issue, and that is the almost exclusive security perspective means that we fail to. I will then try to relate it to the broader political, social process in Africa, and say something how we can understand the expressions of Salafism within Africa. Salafism at the outset is a religious movement. I will elaborate on that. It's not a political movement at the outset. The word itself comes from al-Salaf, al-Salih, which stems from the, it means basically the pious ancestors of Islam, that looks back to the 4 caliphs in early Islamic history as the golden, pure, ideal period of Islam. And that means that Salafism is not something new. Salafism has basically existed as long as Islam has existed. It goes back in time to one of the legal scholars of Islam, Ibn Hanbal. It goes via Ibn Taymiyyah, and it continues up to modern time, where the focus has been to maintain a kind of purity within Islam. And the main features, I can't do justice to the complexity of it, but I just want to highlight 3 main features when it comes to how Salafism can be understood. 1, a very strict focus on Tawhid, on only one God, on monotheism. And a rather elaborate description of what Tawhid means has been developed within what we call then Salafism. And in conjunction with that, Salafis are radically opposed to any kind of what they see as addition to that exclusive focus on only one God, which they then regard as bid'ah, as innovations. And these are often elements connected to Sufism, it's connected to local cultural practices, pilgrimages, shrines, veneration of saints, the celebration of the prophet's birthday, and so on. And that relates to the third point, that they often seem to be strict literalists. Everything which should be legitimate religious practices needs to have its evidence from Scripture, foremost the Quran, and of course then also the traditions from the Hadith.
The talk of the town within Christianity. Globally, only the Catholic Church is bigger than the Pentecostal movement. Anyone who has traveled to Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America or Asian countries such as South Korea or the Philippines have seen the evidence in forms of multitude of churches, billboards, TV shows, street missionaries, even several born-again presidents. I am very grateful for the opportunity to talk about Christianity today. It is often overlooked as a political factor in international relations. But like most religious movements today, they do not seek to transform society through violence, but through a bottom-up, multi-institutional approach aiming at the gradual transformation of society. And this approach has yielded impressive results. If we keep a comparative focus, we are not only true to the facts on the ground, but it may also aid our thinking about Islam, the topic of today. Nigeria is a particularly interesting case in this respect. With its 170 million inhabitants, Nigeria is by far the biggest country in Africa, a population that is divided roughly 50-50 between Muslims and Christians. Parallel to the growth of reform movements in Islam, there has been a growth in reform movements within Christianity, as exemplified with Pentecostalism.
Salafism is related to its growth in West Africa and to sort of more general processes pertaining to the reception and development of Salafist movements in contexts where Sufism has been predominant. And I think it's safe to say that most observers agree that the relevance of Islam in people's lives in West Africa.
Director of the newly established Center for African Studies, Professor Kjetil Tornvold, on this occasion. I have to say, by way of an initial caveat, first, I suppose everyone can hear me. I'm from Bergen, so I usually speak loud enough. But anyway, I'm coming from this, from a particular vantage point, that of having undertaken research on Muslims in Cape Town, South Africa. It's quite some years ago now, my PhD on
Salafist specialist, because I see my next year sitting, all of them are speaking about religion, Islam. I'm alien to this field, I think, but I am sociologist and societal oriented, and I want just to share with you my personal experience as a Muslim, as Eritreans, and so on. First of all, I want to say that 50% of the Eritrean population are Muslims, according to the government statistics and so on. And this Muslim claim to be the indigenous Muslim of the Horn of Africa, because they trace their background back to the first Muslim immigrants from the Arabian Peninsula, and they say that they are attached, and the Islam war spread in this area than in Saudi Arabia by itself. Therefore, they identify themselves with Islam, and they see Islam as their cultural heritage, and they don't accept it to be colored as minority or as alien groups or immigrants and so on by other groups and so on. Islam was expanded in Eritrea through religious families which attached to the Sufi schools and orders and traditions.